Hello, this is the next instalment in my recording of The Children of Green Knowe by Lucy M. Boston. The next day, Mrs. Aldknow and Tolly set out by bus to visit the nurseries where they were to choose the pear tree. Tolly's mind had been busy. He had notions of his own about a present for his great-grandmother, an idea that had come when he was turning over the pages of Adam's Seeds. It suited him very well to go to the nursery garden. They were met by the old foreman. He looked like a field mouse, if a field mouse could be as big as a small man and wear an old grey hat and gaiters. His eyes twinkled and his movements were quick and sudden. Mrs. Aldknow could never get to the end of a sentence before he answered, "Yes, lady," or "No, lady," as the case might be, speaking rapidly as if he were nibbling. Tolly thought it was a pity he had no whiskers to wiggle as he said it. He said, "Yes, sir, no, sir," to Tolly, who had never been called sir before. While Mrs. Aldknow was wandering up and down the lines of young pear trees to pick a strong one, Tolly put a private question. "Have you a rose in a tiny pot that only grows 3 inches high?" "Yes, sir, rosa minimissima, sir. 3 and 6pence, sir." "Does it smell?" "Yes, sir, they say so, sir. If your nose is small enough, sir." Tolly had some money which his father had sent him, so he paid and put the tiny parcel in his pocket. Then he joined Mrs. Aldknow. The pear tree was a little disappointing because, of course, it had no leaves. The one in the illustration to the song was in full blossom, not just sticks. "I suppose they did it by magic," said Tolly sadly. "Must have done, sir. Sure, sir," said the foreman. It was thawing slowly, and they spent the rest of the day in the town where they forgot all about the snow, which, in any case, had been shovelled up there and carted away. When they came home again at tea time, it was to find the garden green and brown and sodden. Tolly's thoughts were full of Christmas, for there were now only 3 days to go. He received a letter from Burma, from his father. The envelope and stamps were exciting, but the letter made him feel further away than ever. There was a P.S. in an oversized scrawly writing. "Mother sends love to Toto." Toesland put the letter in the fire, but kept the envelope. At night he dreamt of Christmas. He found the field mouse foreman decorating the Christmas tree. This time he had long, wiggling whiskers. He was busy hanging up coconuts and strings of peanuts, pears hung on skewers, and bags of silver net full of almonds and raisins. His eyes were brimming with twinkle, and his cheeks were full of nuts. He hung up a small, round, red cheese. Presently, out of his bulging pockets, from which hung a tail of raffia, he pulled a parcel wrapped in paper on which were printed coloured maps. It was all covered all over with foreign postmarks. He looked at this, wiggled his whiskers, and dropped it at Tolly's feet. Tolly unwrapped it, as full of anticipation as if he expected Aladdin's lamp. Inside, in cotton wool, were 2 plastic big toes, such as you might buy from the joke counter in toy shops, to fit over your socks. There was also a card saying, "For little Toto." Tolly was in a rage. He stamped and shook the Christmas tree furiously. The field-mouse foreman stopped staring at him and suddenly, with frightened eyes, dwindled to a real field mouse and, with his tail held up, whisked away and disappeared. Tolly woke up quietly. "Mouse," he said into his pillow, and he thought he felt a wriggle under it. He laughed softly to himself. At breakfast, grinning over the top of his cup at Mrs. Aldknow, he said, "I've thought of a present for Boggis." "Clever boy. A Boggis is always so difficult. Oh, what is it?" 2 plastic big toes to fit over his socks to frighten his wife with." "Where have you seen those?" "I haven't. I invented them last night in bed, but somebody else may have invented them too." Conjurers have pretend thumbs with long iron nails sticking through them to frighten people. Who decorates the Christmas tree? You and I do. We'll do it tomorrow. Shall we hang presents for the birds? I mean, coconuts, peanuts and things. Well, we will. Outside on the yew tree for Christmas Day. And hazelnuts for the squirrels and woodpecker. And biscuits on the ground for the robins and blackbirds. I dreamt all that, said Tolly proudly. You're a good dreamer. What else? Well, there's Truepenny and hedge prickles, and there ought to be an invitation to field mice. Truepenny and hedge prickles could have some truffles for a treat. I've a little jar that was given me that I don't think I shall ever use. And field mice love bird seed. You shall make trails from different parts of the garden, leading to the tree. It will be their tree, of course. Of course. Which else? You wouldn't want to hang everything on Green Knowe to make a Christmas tree of him, would you? Tolly only grinned. He was in high spirits and had more grins than he knew what to do with. So much so that when he was larking around the garden by himself, not looking for the others but just taking it for granted that they were there, he had a sudden inspiration to show off for their benefit. Dancing along the path that circled Green Knowe, which was as near as he could come because of the brambles, he chanted Lynette's song at the top of his voice. Green Knowe, demon tree, evil fingers can't catch me. Then he did a kind of war dance, such as the owl had done in his dream. He was so pleased with it that he capered off across the lawn, getting wilder and wilder, stamping, whirling and pointing till he bumped into Boggis. Anyone would think you'd been drinking, acting so silly, said Boggis severely. Mrs. Old Knowe is waiting for you to decorate the tree in the music room. Off ran Tolly, still full of joy. We must do it today, said Mrs. Old Knowe. There will be so much to do tomorrow. Look, Boggis has brought in the holly and the ivy and the mistletoe. We will put that up first. When they had finished decorating it, the old room looked more like the knight's hall than ever. Against the stone walls on top of the stone chimney-piece, the dark green leaves themselves looked medieval. It was an ancient castle prepared for an ancient feast. When Tolly was handing up great bunches to Mrs. Old Knowe on the steps, it often seemed to him not so heavy as he expected, as if someone were helping him. Did they do this? He asked. Yes, they always decorated the house, but they didn't have a Christmas tree. Christmas trees began much later, in England at any rate. They had their feast in our dining room, which their father had altered and improved. It was he who had our big fireplace put in, and the big windows on to the garden. And it was their mother who first used this as a music room. She used to teach them some of the songs that I teach you. It was late afternoon before they finished the Christmas tree, and it was growing dark. They lit the old red Chinese lantern and many candles, so that they could see to work. There were no glaring electric bulbs on this tree. Mrs. Old Knowe had boxes of coloured glass ornaments, each wrapped separately in tissue paper and put carefully away from year to year. Some were very old and precious indeed. There were glass balls, stars, fir cones, acorns and bells in all colours and sizes. There were also silver medallions of angels. Of course, the most beautiful star was fixed at the very top, with gold and silver suns and stars beneath and around it. Each glass treasure, as light as an eggshell and as brittle, was hung on a loop of black cotton that had to be coaxed over the prickly fingers of the tree. Tolly took them carefully out of their tissue paper, and Mrs. Old Knowe hung them up. The tiny glass bell clappers tinkled when a branch was touched. When it was all finished, there were no lights on the tree itself, but the candles in the room were reflected in each glass bauble on it, and seemed in those soft, deep colours to be shining from an immense distance away, as if the tree were a cloudy night sky full of stars. They sat down together to look at their work. Tolly thought it so beautiful he could say nothing. He could hardly believe his eyes. As they rested there, tired and dreamy and content, he thought he heard the rocking horse gently moving. But the sound came from Mrs. Oldknow's room, which opened out of the music room. A woman's voice began to sing very softly a cradle song that Tolly had learnt and dearly loved. Lully lulla, thou little tiny child, bye bye, lully lully. Oh, sisters too, how may we do for to preserve this day? This poor youngling for whom we sing, bye bye, lully lully. Who is it? He whispered. It's the grandmother rocking the cradle, said Mrs. Oldknowe, and her eyes were full of tears. Why are you crying, Granny? It's lovely. It is lovely. Only it is such a long time ago, I don't know why that should be sad, but it sometimes seems so. The singing began again. Granny, whispered Tolly again, with his arms through hers. Whose cradle is it? Lynette is as big as I am. My darling, this voice is much older than that. I hardly know whose it is. I heard it once before at Christmas. It was queer to hear the baby's sleepy whimper only in the next room, now, and so long ago. Come, we'll sing it too, said Mrs. Oldknowe, going to the spinet. She played, but it was Tolly who sang alone, while 400 years ago a baby went to sleep. They went down then for their tea, which they needed badly, for they had worked long and hard, as well as hearing strange things. Tolly was very good at lighting candles. He did not spill wax or drop red-hot matches. He helped to get the tea ready and made excellent toast. He could hardly believe he was the same boy who had spent miserable holidays alone in an empty school. I shall take you to midnight mass tomorrow, if you would like to come, and if the weather is possible. It is a long walk. Do you know, I thought I heard thunder a minute ago. Who ever heard of thunder at Christmas? Tolly was far too excited to think of going to bed. His head was in a whirl, thinking of the Christmas tree, of the live partridge that would arrive tomorrow, of his present for his great-grandmother, of the probability that there would be some sort of present for him, of the cradle song in Mrs. Oldknow's room, of the children, of the loveliness of everything. The only thing he never thought of was something he had done himself that morning. Now he was trying to contrive ways of staying up longer. Asking questions seemed the easiest way. Shall we go to midnight mass if it snows? I believe it is the thunder, said Mrs. Oldknowe. Open the door, Tolly, and listen. Tolly opened the door into the garden. It was a dark evening with tattered clouds in front of a slaty sky. He heard no thunder. It was even unnaturally quiet. Perhaps it only seemed unnatural because he himself was brimming with excitement. He heard the weir pounding at the end of the garden. It only made the quietness quieter. It was rather like a heart that is only heard when it beats too loudly. Tolly wondered how loud Fest's heart would sound if you put your head against his ribs after a gallop. Granny, he said, I haven't put any sugar for Fest. Can I take the flashlight and go out with some before I go to bed? Yes, she said. Your name should be Hopeful. Shut the door, it's cold. He let the heavy curtain fall behind him and went out, shutting the door. He was surprised to see how short were the stretches of garden that the flashlight lit up in front, and it lit nothing at all at the side. It was difficult to find the familiar paths, but he was childish enough to play that he was on a motor bicycle. Instead of going the nearest way to the stable, he set off along the lawn, following his tiny beam, intending to go all round the garden side of the stables and in at the far corner. He had just discovered that whichever way he turned it, the beam lit up nothing at all but grass, so that he was not even sure of his direction. When he was startled nearly out of his skin by a long-drawn screech from the peacock. For a minute he thought it was a terrifying bugle. Tolly stood stock still. Then came thunder like a rattle of drums. The effect was like the opening of a Punch and Judy show on a monstrous scale, a Punch and Judy show that wasn't for fun. He looked all around. There were no stars. For once the curtains were all drawn in the house and no lights shone. He could see the point of the roof against a patch of sky, but the walls were muffled with darkness, as if it was something real that he would have to struggle through to get back. The garden was not pitch black, but it seemed covered over with a mass of shadow. There were many overlapping shadows that he couldn't tell what anything was. He couldn't tell a tree wasn't a shadow till he bumped his face on a branch. He was alone, and the garden seemed no longer his. He felt like a trespasser as he moved along it. The thought reminded him of Black Ferdy. He wished he had gone straight to Fest's protective store. His flashlight was growing weaker and weaker. It was only a little pin of light. He shook it. It died out altogether. At that moment he remembered what he had done in the morning. He remembered how he had danced and pointed and pulled faces. He heard again Toby's voice saying, "Don't go near him," and Alexander saying, "He is eyeless and horrid," and "The only thing the confounded peacock is good for." The peacock gave a screech that seemed unending. Tolly could imagine how it would stretch out its neck long and thin in the effort, with curved open beak and wagging tongue. When it stopped, there was a sound of dragging, of brushing and snapping twigs. The other birds woke and flew out of their roosting places with a panicky twittering. In the dark, Tolly could hear them moving from tree to tree across the garden in agitated bands, as if they were escaping from a forest fire. He himself remained rooted to the ground. He did not know which way to run, where there would not be entangling branches or the edge of a path to trip him up. How could one hide from the blind? They would not even know you were hiding. The fumbling fingers were just as likely to hit on you behind a bush as in the open. Then there came a flash of lightning in which the whole scene was clearer than the sharpest thought. By its terrible flicker, Tolly saw the middle of the lawn, a tree where no tree should be, a tree shaped roughly like a stooping man, that waved its arms before him and clutched the air with its long fingers. In the clap of thunder which followed, Tolly, frozen with terror, raised his thin child's voice in screams of "Lynette! Lynette!" Perhaps he had no need to call, for as the thunder died away in distant precipices of sky, Lynette's voice, like an anxious bird, was beating the air, calling, "St. Christopher! St. Christopher! Come quickly, St. Christopher!" Other voices joined hers, Toby's and Alexander's, piercing and boyish, and other unknown children's. Suddenly their cries ceased. Did that mean it was already too late? That in the darkness any moment he would be pounced upon and feel the tightening of the leafy fingers? Or had St. Christopher heard? Was he already stirring the creepers or moving out from the house? Moaning and winds were rushing and leaping round the circle of the garden, leaving a silence in the centre where something dreadful was certainly taking place. It felt like the pressure of opposing thunderstorms before they break. The air was prickly and the suspense so great that Tolly could not breathe, could hardly stand. His heart nearly choked him. At last a great forked lightning zigzagged out of the sky, so bright that Tolly could not see anything else, with instantaneous thunder crashing and rolling, enough for 10 lightnings. The air was full of a smell of burning. "Ah," said Lynette, Toby and Alexander from the shadows. Ah, said lots of other happy voices. Green Knowe's gone. As Tolly reached the house, not knowing if he walked or ran, the door opened with a flood of warm light, and Mrs. Old Knowe came out to look for him. Tolly! Tolly! Are you all right? What's happened? Has anything been struck? Green Knowe's gone, said Tolly, falling in a dead faint in her arms. Shall I carry him in, ma'am? Said Boggis, appearing with his lantern. I came up to see if you were all right. He carried Tolly in and laid him in a big armchair. Then he fetched a jug of cold water and Mrs. Old Knowe splashed some on Tolly's face. He's had a fright, that's what it is, said Boggis. A rare fright by the look of it. I'll go out and see if I can find anything burning or anyone about. You'll be all right till I come back. When Tolly opened his eyes again, the first person they rested on was Toby, who was standing with Alexander by the fireplace. Fest's calling you, said Tolly faintly. I know, said Tolly. He trumpeted his loudest when old Noah was struck. I was just waiting for you to come to yourself again. I'll go now. I wish I could see Fest, said Tolly, turning a tired head on his cushion. Toby gave him his most brilliant smile. Perhaps Christmas Day is your lucky day, he said. You should try wearing his clothes, said Alexander. Lynette and Mrs. Old Knowe were kneeling by the arm of his chair. He smiled happily at them. Then he remembered how silly he had been, and his smile went crooked and funny. Lynette pulled what she thought was a terrifying face and wiggled her fingers at him, and they both laughed. Toby went out, passing Boggis in the doorway, who came in without appearing to see him, or Alexander or Lynette. Tolly was sitting up, looking nearly himself again, but Boggis was looking very queer. Sit down, Boggis, said Mrs. Old Knowe. You look upset. What is the matter? I hope there's nothing serious. Boggis wiped his bald head with a coloured handkerchief. There's nothing burning now, he said with an effort at calmness. But there's been a tree struck. There's a charred stump lying on the edge of the lawn. Can't think where it fell from. And there's things moving. What things, Boggis? I wouldn't let us say, ma'am. Things as didn't ought to. Stone things, said Lynette in a whisper to Tolly, laughing all over her face. Mrs. Old Knowe poured out a brandy and gave it to Boggis. Drink that, she said. I know you are a teetotaler, but it will do you good. The Tolly's had some. Boggis poured it down his throat and smacked his lips. And I saw something queer too, he said, beginning to twinkle again. I met someone in the garden, and who do you think it was? Now who do you think? Mrs. Old Knowe and Tolly made no suggestions. Well, believe it or not, if I could believe my own eyes, I'd say it was my grandfather. Boggis has died 60 years ago, and as drunk he was, as drunk as a lord and singing hymns to God Almighty. This time it was Mrs. Old Knowe who laughed. Tolly turned to share the joke with Alexander and Lynette, but they had vanished. A dear old grandfather, Boggis, said Mrs. Old Knowe. I liked him very much when I was a child. He was so funny when he was drunk. I was never frightened of him. So he's celebrating tonight, is he? Soon Tolly was comfortably tucked up in bed and felt at peace with everything. Old Noah was gone for good and all. It even seemed almost a pity. What shall we do now? He asked Mrs. Old Knowe. Will you change the name of the house back to Green Knowe? No, I come to like Green Knowe better. We'll plant a new one. We'll have Noah and Mrs. Noah, one each side of the floodgate, and I'll get Father Patrick to come and bless them.